In one of your media interviews with The Discourse, you describe your life as a beautiful journey. And I wanted to ask you about forgiveness and healing. You know, you had some traumas, pains from family member, spoke of your father, and others within your family, the systems that failed you as a young girl, they failed you. And so there was a great deal of pain there. Now you are a voice of strength that many Indigenous and non-Indigenous girls, men and boys, would admire and look up to. And I guess my question for you around that is, how have you forgiven? How have you managed forgiveness and healing to get to the place you are today?
It's a great question. I think oftentimes people equate forgiveness with letting people off the hook, right? But forgiveness is not the same as accountability. Forgiveness is, like, for me, forgiveness is about me. Letting go. It's not about letting someone off the hook, or it's not about holding abusers or people who've caused institutional harm. It's about letting that go.
So today on the podcast, I am really honored to welcome a guest I have wanted to host for quite some time, and she's been quite busy writing her second book. I just finished reading her first book, which is a national bestseller, Unbroken, award-winning, award-nominated ×2, very impressive read, and the critics agreed, as well as Canadians and other readers. I would really like to welcome today Angela Sterritt. She's a journalist. She's a best-selling author, a motivational speaker, and an advocate for Indigenous voices. Angela, thank you for being on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
It's really exciting to have you here. Journalism is very close to me. It's also what I studied but never practiced. And also reading and writing is a passion. I really enjoyed your book, as devastating as parts of it were. It was a brave write, and it's hard to put the pen to paper, I find. It's a brave thing to do. And I really thought, wow, this book is, it moved me. It was educational. It was unforgettable. And something that I think is important for a topic like this. I want to start with, first I'd like to acknowledge the land that I'm on today as a non-Indigenous person. I work here in South Surrey, so we're on the shared unceded territory of the Semiahmoo, Katsi, and Kwantlen and Coast Salish peoples here in South Surrey. Can we start by learning a bit about your background for those of the listeners who are not aware what nation you're from, a little bit about your cultural background on your mother and father's side, and as a secondary question, do you feel as though you were connected to and proud of your culture growing up?
Yeah, so my dad he's my late father, Charles Sterritt. He was from the Gitxsan Nation, and his father, Walter Sterritt, was groomed most of his young life. As a boy, people would bring him gifts because it was known that he would grow into the role of the wee men, or the hereditary chief of Wigach, the House of the Big Wings. I belong to that house group now. We are a matrilineal culture. So my mother is non-Gitxsan. She's also passed away. She was a white woman from a tiny island called Belle Isle, Newfoundland, and her people came from the Isles of Jersey and from Northern Ireland and settled here. And so I always talk to people about my responsibility on that side of my heritage, which is to disrupt, to dismantle, to hold systems to account that side of my ancestors may have tacitly consented to, intentionally or not, built and maintained, that harmed Indigenous people. And then on my father's side, because my mother was white, in our culture, in order to be recognized as Gitxsan, you need to be formally brought into your house group. So that would be my grandfather's house group. He actually said no to the role, and his brother took the role over as a young adult. Neil Sterritt took over the role of Wigach and became Wigach until he passed away a few years ago at the age of 107 years old.
Wow.
Yeah. And so I was formally brought into his house group a couple of years ago and given my name, Lo Ogia Zumkbist, by Chuis, who's my cousin and my elder and my language teacher, an amazing person, Dr. Jane Smith. And so on that side of my heritage, it's my responsibility to reclaim my language, our ceremonies, our connections, our families, and uphold our people and become what has been really enunciated to me over the past year, this concept or theory that can be expanded beyond Indigenous people. And that's this concept of we are all one, which I can get into later. But I think that's really an important focus for Indigenous people and all people right now, given the state of humanity, is to come together as human beings, regardless of the differences we have. And then for your other question, Gitxsan people are pretty fierce. I love our people. Our women, our men, our gender diverse kin are just always proud of who we are and the lengths that we've needed to come in order to get to where we are and continue to reclaim our land, reclaim our connections. And we have a very strong feast hall system. Our laws, our culture is very strong. And that's what I grew up with. I grew up with a sense of pride about all that my people had achieved, especially in the Delgamuch. It's a bit of a loaded question because me and my fiance were just talking about this last night. There's such an effort to, I know this isn't a word, but invisibilize us, right? So whether it's in high school or in politics or social capital, we're constantly in many ways dehumanized. And that was an experience that I felt and went through in elementary and high school, and that people still experience today. So when I was in high school, my dad had told me, like, don't tell people you're Indigenous because they'll treat you differently. And it's something that we were talking about last night too, in that no matter how many awards that I won, and we can get into this later too, or, you know, the top awards in Canada and the most incredible journalism, you're always sort of treated as a sidebar. And so there's sort of like, I think for all Indigenous peoples, you know, we're multidimensional people, but there's sort of these two ways that we show up in the world. One, that we have so much pride and love of our people. And on the other side, this sort of radical acceptance that will never be accepted in white supremacist society, and reckoning with that. And that's okay because we have each other and we have such strong roots and pride in who we are.
I love how you use the word disruption, and I believe you used it in the book as well as some of your other writing. Fierce people in general, I find, especially fierce women, and I would imagine, I cannot put myself in your position, but an Indigenous woman, if you want to make change, you need to be disruptive. And I think that's incredibly admirable. Would you call yourself a disruptive professional?
I think it goes back to what I was saying in the beginning about knowing my responsibility as someone who is part white and someone who can code switch. Absolutely, people who have power and privilege in this society, they have to be the disruptors. You know, oftentimes as Indigenous people, we don't have any, especially women. Let's be honest about that. It's a very different experience to be an Indigenous woman in colonial spaces. And we often don't have power or privilege whatsoever, no matter how many times harder we work, no matter how many more awards we get. We kind of need proxies sometimes, you know. I might pitch a story about something that I feel really passionate about, that I have all the sources for, that I have all the investigative chops for. And it's sort of, yeah, that's an interesting story, but I'm going to take a pass. But then a white woman comes into the room and pitches the exact same story with the exact same eloquence and thought and sources that I had. And it's like, wow, that's amazing. So we're still, unfortunately, in a time period where it's almost like we do need those proxies, and those proxies do need to be disruptive. And that's where we're falling short, I believe, is that Indigenous people shouldn't be the only ones disrupting or speaking up about injustice or pointing out the design flaws in the systems or challenging racist stereotypes, it has to be white people who hold the power and privilege in society, in institutions, in social situations. So that needs to be done a lot more, and people need to really rise above fear that they may feel and lean into love a lot more.
Yeah, and I guess that would include the media. I've
Yeah.
had experience of my own pitching. I have a fantastic client, and I love this client because not only are they wonderful as a client, but they are teachers to me because they are an Indigenous nonprofit organization. And so they are generous with their teachings. And I'm constantly learning. And that's a privilege for me. As I pitch their stories, wonderful stories of supports and services and such, you know, the media are receptive, yet some are less receptive than I would expect or think. And I've been doing this for now, PR, for about 25 years.
Wow.
So I can usually identify when a story has some legs to it. And I still notice that there are media outlets who are less receptive. It's almost as if some of them want to tick the box the odd time, if that makes sense, by covering stories of Indigenous peoples. And then other times they, you know, are not. And that's just my experience. And that's certainly not all media outlets, but I have noticed that. And I know you write in your book and you just mentioned about really pushing these stories forward. But you're right. It's the job of all of us to be that disruptive force for the better, you know, disruptive for the good. So for your book, Unbroken, which is for those of you who have not read it, it's part memoir and part investigative reporting into the missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada. The book became an instant bestseller. It was released in 2023. It was nominated for both the Governor General's Literacy Award and the Hilary Weston Writers Trust Award for Best Nonfiction Book in Canada. So it was a powerful book, shared the story of both, you know, your traumatic beginnings and upbringing, spending time on the streets, really having to develop a pretty thick skin, and your transition into building this incredibly successful career where you're now an advocate, a journalist, and a writer. Essentially, you are the one sharing information and putting it out there for people to hear, read, listen to, consume, which is incredible. What a change. At the same time, you know, the devastating realities of the missing and murdered women that you write about in the book must have been incredibly hard to, you know, as speaking to the families and writing the book and researching. I'm just wondering if you can speak to writing the book, what drove you to write it, and also, you know, how was it writing about such a devastating topic that must have been incredibly close to your heart?
Yeah, I mean, because I did grow up on the street and because I was always sort of weaving my way in and out of different communities, a lot of people didn't understand my experience on the street. And so I was always a really good storyteller, and people, you know, my family, it's sort of in our DNA to be good storytellers, right? But I had some wicked stories from the street, good and bad, interesting, unique. And so people would always be like, I mean, some people wouldn't even believe some of the things that I shared, but people would always say, you got to write a book, like, you know. And my mother, I think my mother and father might have actually met in some sort of writing class. So my mother was always wanting to write a book, and it was a very different life than me, than what I wrote about. But so I always kind of wanted to write the story of my life. And then when I started reporting in Yellowknife, I was stationed in Yellowknife for 4 years. And, you know, thanks to the brilliant seminal work of Connie Walker, we started, you know, pushing the news rooms to start telling the stories of missing and murdered Indigenous women. Whereas before they were sort of cast away with excuses, right? They're too depressing. You know, journalists speak for, whoa, I'm uncomfortable with this. You know, let's maybe do a story about a dog on a roof or a bear in the city.
Aye.
But, you know, thanks to her work and thanks to her pushing and so many others, Wabgijik Rice, we began to tell in-depth stories about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls through a unit dedicated to that. So I started to think about sort of blending my story with theirs, because I thought, you know, my story, I can kind of give people an inside view. You know, I'm not just reporting on this. I've been there. You know, I've been in the so-called belly of the beast, in the child welfare system, on the streets, super vulnerable, super susceptible to violence. I've experienced hitchhiking. That's right. Super terrifying. And then experiencing violence on the street. And, what a better way to sort of shine a spotlight into how all these systems are connected. They're not separate when it comes to colonization. These are all systems that work effectively together and are engineered to ensure that we are oppressed. And so when I started writing it, I started kind of writing it as a fiction story. And I went to Banff and I was alongside Wabagijik Rice again, Cherie Demeline, Hikua Lulu, and a bunch of other people. And I was very nervous and would read my writings really fast. And they were always like, you need to slow down, you need to slow down. And eventually I was like, let's be honest. I want to write a nonfiction story about my life. And sometimes in some ways it's harder, I think, to write fiction when it comes to trauma because you almost need more detail. And I wanted to protect my readers, right? I wanted to care for them as they're reading through this. I didn't want to share gratuitous details. I don't like reading those stories. It makes me close the book when I start hearing these things that are traumatizing to me as a reader. I was like, what about if I write memoir and investigative journalism? And I couldn't find any books that had that model, that matched that model. And so then I was stationed in Winnipeg for a little while, and I went to Cecil Rosner, an incredible investigative journalist who now runs the Investigative Reporting Foundation, maybe, another incredible outlet. And I said, do you think I can do this, investigative journalism and memoir? And he said, yeah. And he said, there's a book, I can't remember that name either. I think it's maybe Blood In, Blood Out, but it's about a journalist uncovering a story that he's a part of. I still haven't read that book, but I was like, okay, I can make this happen. This has been done before. I can break boundaries in this, literary world. Yeah. And then it just became more and more about me. It was much less, but my editor and my agent were like, you got to include more of yourself because you're an anchor in this story. And I'm so glad that they did that. But it's hard to write about yourself, right? Especially as a journalist, as I'm sure you know from talking to people in that field. You're not supposed to include yourself in the story. It's a huge no-no. But I think things are changing, especially with the advent of podcasts. People are realizing how important lived experience is as a form of expertise, not just when it comes to, say, like overseas reporting, but what it means to be an Indigenous woman with a lived experience, reporting on Indigenous women. That is required, I believe. So yeah, it was a difficult. It took 7 years to write it. Writing is really hard. Whether you're writing about difficult subjects or not, writing is difficult.
What was your process during those 7 years? Where do you kind of start and stop or, sit with it for 16 hours at a time?
I mean, you have to think about it this way. I was a journalist. And I think when like Twitter and stuff first came out, I mean, we'd work almost like 24 hours a day. Our phone was always on. We had to be live tweeting stuff. I remember going to police press conferences and they'd be like, well, what on earth are you people doing as journalist people? Like we'd have one for the live Twitter, whatever, one for the camera and we'd have like 3 things.
Oh my.
Right. And eventually the producers were like, this is not sustainable. Like we were filing, and I think people still do. You file every day for digital radio, sometimes do reporter debriefs on the morning show. Sometimes you're doing lives at 4 a.m. for national. Sometimes I'd be doing 24 hits across the country. That was my life. And I was a single mom when I was in Yellowknife, I had a baby. And by the time I was in Winnipeg, he was 6. And so I was a single mom sometimes I'd be carrying him in the newsroom, pitching stories. Like, oh
my.
It was wild. Like, I don't know how I did that. So a lot of it is a blur, but it was just anytime I had extra time writing, right? And then those early days, especially in Winnipeg, were really traumatic because I was writing it still as fiction then. So a lot of like late nights crying on the floor. And I think for this book, what I learned from the first book was a lot about self-care and self-nourishing. And what does that mean? It's very different than bubble baths and Netflix now.
Yes.
And so that's a practice that I have now. And my next book is a lot more about healing And it's also traumatic in many ways, but there was much more care and love. And not that there wasn't love and care in my first book, but there's a lot more, I guess, healing modalities to lean into than there was in my first book. So my first book was, it was a lot of raw emotions coming up and trauma therapy, a lot of therapy, and learning to get the right therapist and all of those things. Yeah.
For those of you who are not aware, I'm just going to skip forward a little bit to the fact that Angela has a second book that is due to be released maybe sometime at the end of this year called Breakable, which will investigate how racism and colonialism cultivate harmful behaviors in men, and how Indigenous men and communities are breaking cycles of unhealthy notions of masculinity. So this topic, why choose this topic for your second book? What kind of transitioned you into the looking at the male perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of writers or songwriters may talk about this, and sometimes, and Elizabeth Gilbert talks about this, the woman who wrote Eat, Pray, Love in her book called Big Magic. And I know this is a little bit like off course, but she talks about this idea of creativity is always around us. I would say it's ancestors personally, and they're always looking for a home for their ideas to be carried out. And sometimes it lands in a person who just can't capacitate it. You know, maybe I'm a reporter doing all these tumultuous stories and I can't capacitate carrying out the idea. But that's kind of how this felt. It just came to me, and I was like, I remember telling my editor before my first book came out, being like, I have this idea, and this is the idea. It will be about men, and it'll be called Breakable, about men breaking unhealthy cycles of patriarchy. And I was so excited about it. And it was like, this is happening. And I feel like I don't really know where it came from, to be honest. And a lot of people, a lot of men, Indigenous men, will tell me like, that seems like a natural next book, right? To go from violence against Indigenous women to men. But I don't know if it really came that. I don't really know how it came or where it came from. It was just like, this is what I want to talk about. And ever since that idea came to me, it was just like, especially at the beginning, every single man that I talked to, you know, I felt like a bit of an anthropologist, you know, a woman doing a story about men, a book about men. And so I thought there'd be a lot of resistance, and all the men were like super interested and curious and hadn't really thought about healthy masculinity or sacred manhood or resisting patriarchy or any of this thing. And they were just leaning in. And there's been more, I think, resistance from women who are like, why focus on men? Like, men get enough attention. Like, they're the ones that run the world. And, you know, that's what Breakable is breaking norms of men carrying, you know, emotional silence or anger or stoicism or disconnection like a badge of honor, and how that's harmed them, right? And how Indigenous men got swept up into these colonial, patriarchal, capitalist behaviors, really, and pulling apart what that means. And I mean, I think one of the most interesting things about writing this book is just how new patriarchy is, relatively speaking, when it comes to our trajectory as Indigenous people, our histories. You know, my people, there's proof that we Gitxsan people have been around for at least 14,000 years, archaeological proof, right? Wow. I mean, Aristotle, who came up with these ideas of women should be in the home because women are, their temperature's colder, like ridiculous snake oil stuff. And men are out in the public and have the power. You know, Aristotle, like that came way later. You know, we're talking just a few hundred years old or a couple thousand years old or less, that these concepts came into play. And Indigenous people, you know, some people that I talk to, there's been a lot of adaptation or assimilation into these notions that traditional, that women take care of the home and men are like just so as if in human beings we're that cut and dry, that one group stays in the home and one is out and one takes care of the children. Like, why are men not able to provide care and love in the world? And that's another big thing that I found in my book, is that when, you know, men cut themselves off from pain, from caregiving, from all of these different things, they're also cutting themselves off from love and appreciation and measuring their worth by not just money, but by love and appreciation and care and wisdom and all of these things. So I'm super excited about this book. It's just been it's like I moved quantum leaps into another world that I didn't know existed. And it's like very regulating. My nervous system is very regulated as a result of this work, which is not what I expected, because especially given all that we're seeing in the world right now, I feel that this book is needed more than ever when we're normalizing child abuse, when we're normalizing human trafficking, when we're normalizing dehumanization of women, brown bodies. We need an alternative. What do we want to build? What do we actually love? What do we want to be outside of what we're opposing? And that's what I feel like this book is about. It's more of like a call in rather than an indictment. It's an invitation to come around the fire and share stories of what we want the future to look like, what we want our children to be like. Because what we're seeing right now is not normal, and it's not right. And we need something different.
Yeah. And I love that the mention of, really stopping that. A counselor recently said to me that you're going to be the one, as the burning bush is going down the hill, you're going to be the one that's going to finally stand up and stop it. And that was a way to kind of represent stopping that generational cycle that continues, right?
Yeah.
And it was really interesting. And I think, that obviously is a different sort of type of intergenerational trauma and issues, but it's, it's so vital that a generation says enough,
Yeah.
and makes us and says, I'm going to take a stand, and this isn't going to go on for my children and their children, and so on and so forth. And it's interesting what you said, that the men were a lot more receptive than you expected. And I wonder if that's because they don't often have the place to speak, or to be asked.
Yeah, that was a huge part of my book, is building spaces for men just to be human, right? Not spaces where you got to be a billionaire, you got to be on your way to be a billionaire, you're on your way to have power and influence, but a space where you can let the guard down and take a breath and cry and emote. And what the Indigenous men said, and I think it's so important that it was Indigenous men that I spoke to, because again, we've had teachings that are still alive today, tens of thousands of years old, to crystallize. And what they were telling me is that we need spaces with each other. We need to build brotherhoods. We need to cry in front of each other. We need to be gentle with each other. We need spaces where we don't need to pretend, where we're not afraid. And I think, that's something, I know that wasn't in your original question, or comment, but the statistics around men, all men, are something that what I found is a lot of people just turn away from. And I break this down in my book, but men are not only, especially young men, the loneliest people on the planet. They represent, this is in North America, particularly the US and Canada and England, or the UK, 75 to 90% of the toxic drug overdose crisis. They represent the larger number of suicides. And they also represent, even though they are the ones perpetuating violence the most, they are also the largest number of victims of homicide, right? And killed by men. And some of that research is coming out. It's also in the home. It's not just through, and not like it should be less than or less investigated, that just because they are killed in different ways than women, for some reason, it doesn't matter. Like they're killed by acquaintances more. They're killed in gang violence or in crime more. Well, why is that? And why aren't we looking into that or picking that apart? And people always want to like resist that, or they don't believe me. And it's like, it's all there. The research is all there. And so this was, I guess, like the impetus for my book. I think it was the spring of 2021. I was covering the toxic drug overdose crisis in Vancouver for television. I'd moved specifically over to television from radio at this time. And I'd asked Guy Felicella, I don't know if you're familiar with him,
Yeah, I do
an
know.
incredible person. He's overdosed 6 times and been brought back to life. Now he works in the field of harm reduction, a lovely person. And I was just confused. I was like shocked, first of all, about these statistics being all men, 75 to 90%. I was like, this number's huge. Why isn't anybody talking about this? And I said, why do you think this is that so many men are represented by this crisis in this way? And he said, I think it's because men are told we can't express emotions. And I was like, what? Not like I didn't believe it, but I was like, I am a little bit shocked to hear this. I had not processed that fully. And that was alarming. And I'm raising a boy, not raising him by myself anymore, but trying to be the mom and the dad and all the relations of a son. How do you raise him to be well and to be safe? A lot of the men told me, I don't feel safe around other men. When I walk in a room, I'm getting ready to fight, in my soul. And how do I raise my son to not fear, not to be feared, not to be walking around like he needs this massive coat of armor on, but someone who can feel free to emote and show care and compassion and show that to himself too. And a lot of it had to do with expressing emotion. And it's hard because I think, I don't know if you feel this way too, but once I started pulling all this apart, I'm like, oh, I do this all the time. As if I'm going to break down crying in a newsroom, as if I'm going to start crying during an interview, because I don't want to take that space away, but I have cried in an interview. I armor up all the time. I pretend like everything's okay. I don't tell people all the details of my life. People aren't ready for that, but we all are sort of walking around dysregulated and armored up and hiding and not allowing ourselves to liberate grief, emotions, love, connection, all of these things. And so, having that space is necessary, but I think all of us, we need to come together in that way. And I think as Indigenous women anyways, we always have that space, right? We're always finding ways to come together and bead or resist or speak up or laugh. Like we just always have that space for each other. Like my Indigenous woman group is massive, massive, and men don't have that, right? Not just Indigenous men, but all men. And a lot of the men that I talked to said, I don't talk to men about anything, maybe hockey, but that's it, or politics. And so men need that space for each other to grow and build like women have, I think it's fair to say, and for us to all come together at one point. And we're at an interesting time right now where I think that energy is growing. You can call it whatever you want. Some people call it divine femininity or divine masculinity. And I think as women, we have that nurturing sort of that we built within ourselves. And the men in that way need to sort of rise up. But there's resistance, right? Because men are clinging to that patriarchal type of masculinity because it's given them power and privilege, but it's taken away from a lot of things that make them human. And so,
yes,
we need to.
Takes away a lot.
It takes away a lot. And we need to see the opposite a lot more, the human side of men.
I'm so glad that you're writing that, Angela, because I've seen a couple of men close to me in the recent years. When you're have a rice cooker or, something that is, what all of a sudden you turn it off and it just like the steam.
Yeah.
That suppression of everything that they have experienced, whether that be a lack of, treatment or care for a mental health condition or the ability to even discuss feelings that are really layered and complicated and hurtful. And then often it rises and it doesn't go away, clearly. It's just suppressed. And sometimes it comes out in ways that are unexpected. Sometimes it may come out in violent ways. Sometimes it may come out in very different ways. But I think that knowledge that you will share in the book will be helpful for many men and women, and women to understand what's going on and to women to support men and men to be supported. Hopefully.
And gender diverse. Yeah.
Yes.
I have a whole chapter in my book that I think is the best. It's so beautiful. And I relate it to cosmology and constellations. And there's so many teachings that gender diverse or non-binary people can teach us. There's so much wisdom there and so much beauty. And I'm very, like, I hope my editor is like loves it as much as me. And it's not because it's in edits right now, second set of edits, but I'm very proud of that chapter. And I'm very humbled by the teachings that Two Spirit people have to offer. And it's the harmony, right? It's the balance that we need right now. And yeah.
Amazing. I just wanted to talk for a minute about journalism. So you started your career in journalism first with the Vancouver Co-op Radio, I believe, and eventually doing pieces with CBC News. You spoke a bit to this, pushing important stories forward, having that resistance and kind of seeing other stories presented by others, accepted by non-Indigenous reporters perhaps, or stories that were not involving Indigenous sources. And you also spoke in the book Unbroken about often journalists not representing the perspectives of the families and often really talking about simply the perspectives of the law enforcement or the regulatory body, which is a huge problem. Is it not only unbalanced, but we're not hearing from the families of these are the people that know the victim or potential victim best, which seems like a massive red flag and must have driven you insane at the time. So I'm just wondering how you feel BC media are doing today in presenting well-balanced and responsible stories on this topic, because the topic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and the topic of discrimination and bias and all of those things, the disproportionate number of Indigenous peoples on the downtown east side, incarcerated, whatever it may be. There are so many issues that continue and that need a lot of attention. How are media doing, do you feel?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I think media is doing better than we were, say, in 2009. And that was, again, in large part to journalists like Connie Walker, Abhijit Rice, Wab Canoe. At the time was doing a lot of really incredible stories. I don't watch the news as much anymore, but I do see it when I go to the gym every day. And when I'm at the gym, there's a TV there. I don't see any Indigenous stories anymore, unless it has to do with tragedy. And we need Indigenous journalists to tell those stories with all the complexity and rigor that they deserve. I know Wamish Hamilton, I believe, is still at CBC and is doing incredible work. I just saw a story he did about a riot at a residential school many, many years ago. But I think Indigenous journalists get burnt out, especially women, faster. We're just not ever sort of accepted, right? So we're always sort of fighting for our place, fighting for the stories to be told in the right way. And yeah, I mean, I also haven't looked. I know there's a lot of more independent journalists like Michelle Seesaw doing some incredible journalism, but I don't see sort of like the movement of excitement that I saw at one point where we were all sort of maybe not working together, but we were all working in our own spaces towards the same goal, which was more investigative stories or more layered or complex stories or Indigenous lensed stories, right? Not just a bunch of non-Indigenous anthropologists telling our stories on behalf of us, which have a very different lens. And I'll give you an example of that. I'm reading this book right now about Katsalano, and the non-Indigenous person telling the story says, the vanished Katsalano Reserve. And it's like, it wasn't vanished, it was burned. And the people were barged over to North Vancouver. Right. This was violent colonialism. It wasn't vanished like it's some mystical thing that just happened. And so we need Indigenous storytellers with our lens and our expertise telling those stories. I don't see that sort of moment in time that we had from, I guess, like maybe 2008 or even 2002, there was a lot of like pushing and momentum, but things sort of unfolded around 2010 when the Eighth Fire came out, or I think it was 2010 or 2011. And people left, people got burnt out, people got tired of different rules for Indigenous people, us being called bias, experiencing racism, microaggressions. So I actually know there's the Indigenous unit at CBC that are doing some excellent work, but I don't see anything outside of that in the way that I believe it should be.
Yeah, it's minimal. It actually leads me to my next question. You have done a variety, helped to lead or led a variety of programming for Indigenous youth, including hip hop dance, rapping, DJing, and even journalism programming in the past. It's Canada data reports that there's a fast growing number of Indigenous youth, and that number is expected to grow quickly in the years to come. So we are going to be seeing a lot of Indigenous peoples coming up into the kind of adulthood, youth adulthood in the years to come. What kinds of support do you feel are vital for this large demographic of Indigenous youth that's growing to succeed in life, but both professionally, but also when it comes to heart and soul? So feeling seen and proud and connected to their culture. In my work with the nonprofit I mentioned, I often hear of youth who are only learning about their culture via the support they're getting through the nonprofit. They didn't have that connection at home, and it makes it hard in the education and in the workspace. So your journalism program, for example, sounds amazing. More programming like that. What do we need to implement and really consider for Indigenous youth to really help to support them?
I mean, the thing that came to me right away is Indigenous languages in schools. So I did a story, you can look it up, for CBC about this boy, a Tsimshian boy. He had everything set up. He had the curriculum that his mom tracked down for him. He had a speaker or a couple of speakers who were fluent. He had all of the things. And it was like the school board, the school, and even programming that was specific to Indigenous people. It was like they were the Spider-Man meme, all pointing fingers at each other. Well, we can't do it because of that, or we can't do it because of them. And this boy was just left to take Spanish or even Chinese. Amazing that those languages are offered, but why aren't Indigenous languages offered in school? That is our connection to our ancestors, to our values, to our land. Those are our sacred connections that are vital. And there might be arguments, well, where are they going to need this in the economy? Well, maybe if there was more impetus and focus put on Indigenous languages, we would rely less on, needing to be French and English or whatever, or maybe we would have a bigger understanding of the complexity of land in Canada, that it's not just French and English. Indigenous people have been here for tens of thousands of years. And I think it's great that we see people like, I did another story about the Lieutenant Governor of BC learning Sanchothan. That's great. But the kids, the young people, they need to learn their languages, and it needs to be offered, or at least a pathway forward. Or even if people have all of these resources that they've already found, space for them to learn their languages. And the school system is incredibly important for young people. I know this because I have a 14-year-old and he goes there for hours a day, and then basketball hours at night. And so these resources are so integral. And there's just things in the school system that don't make sense. They have, I won't get into all the specifics about that, but if you're going to teach Indigenous culture as sort of this thing just for Indigenous people, that needs to be the entire school. And it needs to be specific to the lands you are on. It can't be smudging and dream catchers. It needs to be, let's talk to Tsleil-Waututh. Let's talk to Squamish people. What do we need to know about the lands that we are on and the cultures that we need to honor here? And so that needs to happen more than ever. And there needs to be less racism, right? I don't know if I put it in my first book, but I put it in my second. I had a TV, a radio host respected for like 30 years tell me off mic, but we were just finishing our hit. My son's a teacher. They're white people. And he has a student who's Indigenous, and he loves being called the CHUG word, which is a extremely harmful slur saying that Indigenous people are all drunks. And he's like, oh, he likes being called that. And I said, let me set the record by saying no kid, no adult wants to be called a racial slur, and Indigenous people are told to suck it up. right? That this was in the past and this is just the way it is. That needs to change. So Indigenous people need to be offered space to and develop our languages, our ceremonies, our cultures, but white people equally need to be focused on their intergenerational racism because and their therapy. The white people also need to heal, or non-Indigenous people. And I'm saying white people because other stories that I've done show that new immigrants will come here and they will learn from the people that have settled here that Indigenous people are bad, right? So white people who have the privilege and power need to be the leaders in this and need to heal from all that they've been taught. They need to heal their nervous systems as well so they're not getting reactive. But we need to come together. You know, as someone who's part white and part Indigenous, these are our responsibilities. It's not on my white side, responsibility to save. You know, Indigenous people don't need saving, but they do need space to reclaim all that was taken. Family, connections, culture, ceremonies, all of these things. And white people do need to focus on their intergenerational racism and their emotions that are unsettled in just as many ways as they are as everybody else. So that's sort of what's needed, I think. And school is a good place to start. And I think the BC school system is doing better than other systems across Canada that I've seen, a lot better. But they could be doing even more better, you know, as always.
Yes, no, I think for the most part, I mean, the school system is probably not a topic for me to discuss. I'm not pleased with it. But one school that you might consider looking at is Wapitung, and they have partnered with Chief Chappelle of Samyamhu Nation there. And he comes in and they kind of really incorporate that into the learning. They have a gathering every Monday, and this is school-wide. And they've really incorporated a respect and love for the land. And that's all not taught by their white teachers, but taught by the nation and the land that they're on. And that's the only time I've seen that kind of incorporation. So it is quite neat. But other schools, I think, are just kind of, doing the status quo, or, some may be better than others. One thing I don't want to miss talking to you about. It's funny because I read the book, but it was actually the introduction to your book that really drew me in. And maybe that's just because of my passion for the written word. But you described the role that writing has played in your life. And I think I mentioned this to you in an email to you, but you refer to your pen. So you would write in journals when you were young, perhaps when you were on the street, but you refer to your pen as a counselor while you're writing about your painful experiences. You talk about your pen became then a tool of strength and resilience, and then your pen becoming, or a tool for you to become, an agent of change. And this really is kind of this evolution of where your writing has taken you and has given all of us via your pen to paper. And I think anything written of any meaning holds a lot of bravery in it. And I just loved how that pen analogy was used in that meaningful way. How did you get that pen to paper? Did you find it challenging at first? And how important has writing been in your life when it comes to kind of moving forward? And has it been therapeutic? That's kind of a lame word to use, but has it taught you things about who you are, who you want to be, what you want to see in the world?
Yeah, I was just thinking about that today because I was listening to this podcast, and I do keynotes now. There was a lot more when my book first came out, but that's sort of my bread and butter right now. So it's sort of like, it's also writing. It's not the written word, it's the spoken word, but I'm always looking for ways to inspire people. And I think people are hungry for that right now, is for solutions. And so it's interesting. Yeah, because my pen has always been, there was a point in my life where I was unable to talk, right? Like, I was very shy and traumatized, and I still am really introverted in many ways. And people find that surprising about me. But there were times in my life when I just had so much more anxiety, and writing was cathartic, and it was just a space of release. And then there was, a time many, many years, like 20 years, where it was like, shining a light into darkness. And I guess it's still sort of like an agent of change, but now it's more of like a medicine or a conduit of creativity. And that's what I love being able to speak truth to power and hold systems to account and all of those things. But at some point it becomes a bit boring, right? And I think that for me as an artist, because I'm also a visual artist, I always wanted people to read my book and say, this is beautiful writing. That would have been the biggest compliment. And I did get that a few times. I actually just received 21 letters from a university of Native American students who were writing praise for Unbroken. Talk about
Wow.
filling my soul at a time when I need it.
That's meaningful.
Yeah, so precious. And to have people moved into change, like that's so powerful. But there's something to be said too about creativity and things that are not needed in the world. We don't need creativity. I mean, we need creativity to come up with solutions, but we don't need art, right? Art is an extra. And there's something to be said about that creativity of just being special. Yeah. And I think that there'll be a lot more of that, hopefully, in book 2. Yeah, it's always been a cathartic process for me, and it's always been a way to provoke change. But at some point for me, that just becomes like boring. Like you need beauty. And a lot of artists will tell me, I just create so people can see the beauty in the world. But it's not necessary, right? It's not perfunctory. It's something extra. And that's what makes it special, I think, is that creativity that comes through.
Was it necessary for you though?
No, I don't think. I think the cathartic, maybe it was. I don't know. I mean, I think that I look at all my journals and there's a lot of images and pictures and imaginings. And I think it's necessary for imagination. I think imagination is so vital in this world. So yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe it is necessary. Maybe it's something that we don't believe is necessary. If we want change, especially right now. But I know there's a difference between, I guess, and creativity. I don't know. I'll have to think on that more. I'll have to get deeper with
something
that.
to ponder. Well, I'm glad that you chose to write.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think about it. I mean, I could talk to you about, I had a very long list of questions. I narrowed them down. I still have too many. I'm going to have to cut a couple of them out, but I want to get to just a couple more things before I let you go. You say in the book, and I'm just going to quote a part of the book here, I don't think that many non-Indigenous people understood then, or even now, the coping mechanisms that some Indigenous people develop to survive the intergenerational trauma of residential schools, dislocation, systematic sexual abuse, cultural genocide, and starvation. So that's a pretty heavy piece of writing. I think I would believe to be definitely true, but I would like you to speak on that, especially when you say or understand even now. And can you speak to how you think non-Indigenous people can better understand? Or should they?
It's hard, right? Because right now there's this confusion in the world. I feel like there's a lot of lost people, especially, well, I want to say almost especially men, but maybe it's everybody. I'm thinking a lot about the residential school deniers as I say this, and thinking about when I see them, what I see. And I see that they're lost, they're disparate, they don't have unity even amongst each other. When they're out at protests, they're sort of angry and pushing, and it's very lost energy to me. It's not cohesive, it's not embracing harmony or love. They're lost and angry and searching for meaning. And maybe they're getting at a certain point in their life where they're questioning their own choices, or they feel a loss of control. And I can't force people to want to even learn about Indigenous people's experiences. I can't force people to care about the genocide happening in Palestine, or people being caged and detained by ICE. I can't force people to care. And I will do what I can to speak out. I will always be that person. It's in my soul. I love to connect. I love to lean into love, but I will also always stand up for my relatives, my kin, my ancestors who survived heinous, torturous conditions. But I also can't tell people how they should be either, or force them to do anything. And in many ways, those types of people, I will speak my truth. I will share the facts. But what I've noticed with those types of people You can share all the facts and evidence that is very accessible in the world today, very accessible, and they will still stay hard. And I know this is off topic about your question, but one of the things I've noticed about those types of people who are like saying residential school, there was no deaths, and it's just super horrific that they're show me the bodies and things like this when there's thousands, 6,000 documents from priests and nuns that document the deaths. This is not new. There's death certificates, but those people I find sometimes they want to engage with you and they want to elicit an emotional reaction. And sometimes it makes me wonder if they're lacking that emotion or that soul in themselves, and that's all that they have. That's the emotion that they can gather. And so my biggest message for those types of people or for non-Indigenous people at all is heal. Go to trauma therapy, do somatic work, regulate your nervous system. There's a woman named Scarlett Lewis who gave the best keynote address I've ever heard in my life. Her son was killed in the Sandy Hook shooting. He was 6, I think he was 6 years old, and he threw himself in front of the shooter to protect his students. Right. And she has this organization now where she talks to young people about love and talks about the highest form of love being attention, where we show our attention. You know, what we love? Are we showing it to our kids? Are we showing it to ourselves? And regulating our nervous system into compassion so that when we see something and we're heated and we're unregulated, to pause, right? And that's confronting capitalism. That's confronting patriarchy. That's confronting colonialism. To pause and to take a minute. You know, sometimes you might smile at someone on the street and they snark at you back and you might be like, oh, and pause and feel and have compassion. And some people aren't ready, and that is not my problem to educate them or to try. My best thing to do in that moment is to let them go. There be people who want to learn and to want to educate and to want to be part of this movement of love, really, and reconnection and reclamation of our humanity. But I can't force anything on anybody, and I will just block. If it's social media or if it's someone who wants to confront people, I will not give them the energy that they're maybe desperate for, which is emotional. I don't have time for that.
I think you brought up a great point. I don't know that everyone is as aware of the unregulation that many or most people are living in, which is causing countless harms to themselves and to everyone around them. They are incredibly unregulated. And I myself, only a year and a bit ago, really regulated myself. I'm in my early 40s. So I listen, this is not pointing fingers, but regulation, I think, is something that people really need to look at within themselves in all areas of their life. And I'm glad that you brought that up and really incorporated that, because it's just so vital. I'm gonna wrap it up so I don't take too much of your time. In one of your media interviews with The Discourse, you describe your life as a beautiful journey. And I wanted to ask you about forgiveness and healing. You know, you had some traumas, pains from family member, spoke of your father, you know, and others within your family, the systems that failed you as a young girl, they failed you. And so there was a great deal of pain there. Now you are a voice of strength that many Indigenous and non-Indigenous girls, men and boys, would admire and look up to. And I guess my question for you around that is, how have you forgiven? How have you managed forgiveness and healing to get to the place you are today?
It's a great question. I think oftentimes people equate forgiveness with letting people off the hook, right? But forgiveness is not the same as accountability. Forgiveness is, like, for me, forgiveness is about me letting go. It's not about letting someone off the hook, or it's not about holding abusers or people who've caused institutional harm. It's about letting that go. And it's hard, you know. Some of the media trauma that I have, it took a really long time to let go, because that was my identity. That was, I mean, I fought for that industry and I fought within that industry to make it better. And I just had so much anger for how I was treated. And I'm still letting that go, right? I think it's an interesting and delicate walk, right? Because you want to, again, speak truth to power and hold people to accountable and speak out against injustice. But in order, again, to go back to regulating and to be good and to get to a place where you're not just regulating all the time, but like, you know, I think I'm in a place now, and it's kind of the same timeline as you. It's been like a couple of years since I really focused on what regulation means, what nourishment means, what self-love is, what self-abandonment is, all of these things. Is there comes a time when you're not just responding to turmoil within anymore. You're not just deep breathing your way through, you know, the nervous system wreckage, but you're like, oh my God, like there's actually space in my emotions, in my somatics, whatever you want to call it, to imagine some, like, this is now like limitless. Like now I can lean into even better, right? Like it's not just like, okay, I'm good now, I'm regulated. It's like now I can do even better. And it's like, so it is a beautiful journey and it is a beautiful process, healing. I remember I heard a woman say like, healing can actually be fun. And I remember being like, oh, healing's so freaking hard. And, you know, we go through those tumults of our healing journey. But just to get to that place right now where it's like, wow, like there's more good things that can come. Like there's more, like there's better, like I can even be better than just regulated. Like there's no end to this. And, you know, things will come up in life, but I always tell like young people, which I find incredibly difficult to talk to young people, teenagers, because I'm like, it's not going to get better. It's actually going to get way harder, but you will get better, right? You will, if you make the choices, you will not become more armored, but you will become more flexible and you will become more, you won't become more, it's not more about being resilient, how well you can take a punch, but it's about feeling like a safety net within yourself and with your community collectively. And yeah, but I think I don't like the word forgiveness. I feel like there's so much baggage with that, religious baggage, political baggage. I like the idea of just letting go versus letting people off the hook. And what
and the
does that?
misunderstandings that go with forgiveness.
Yeah. And I mean, you know, when I think about forgiveness on that scale, I think about, you know, there's stories or podcasts I've listened to where, you know, a mom will meet the killer of her son in prison and what it took to get there. And yeah, everybody should listen to Scarlett Lewis and the project she's created. It's all about love and it's all about healing our nervous systems and getting into that prefrontal cortex instead of living in our amygdala. And she's like, that level of growth to me is unbelievable. And she said something at her son's funeral, which is, I'm so filled with anger and rage that this happened, but I want everybody to think of a good thought that they can carry on my son's behalf today. And I think for a lot of people that was life-changing. And thoughts are everything. You know, thoughts, feelings and thoughts lead to behaviors and policies and treatment, and they're powerful. And that's something that I've learned too, is being able to be mindful of what I'm thinking and how powerful those thoughts are.
Yes.
And it ties into letting go. It ties into letting go of self-doubt, of self-hatred, hating so much about the world. And how can we do both? How can we fight injustice and also love our brothers and sisters so much that those two things aren't separate? And there's a Jimi Hendrix quote that I can end on, which is, when we get to a point where power of love supersedes the love of power, that's when we know where we have finally come to harmony in our lives.
I like that. You know, I like that. Thank you for bringing awareness about the word forgiveness. I'm going to think about that, and kind of all that it entails in my own life, actually. Well, I can't believe the time has gone by so quickly. It's amazing. I think it's just that I had so much to talk to you about, and thank you so much for sharing. This is the 2023 book, best-selling book, Unbroken by Angela Sterritt. She's an author, best-selling author, journalist, motivational speaker, and advocate for Indigenous voices, and many other things. I think you play many vital roles by the looks of it, beyond how I've described you here today. And I just wanted to thank you for your time today, Angela, and really, really looking forward to your next book, and hope to have you on again to discuss it when it comes out, hopefully later this year. And that's Breakable, which will be hopefully coming out in late 2026. So it's Angela Sterritt here today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. It was great to catch up.
Take good care.
You too. Be kind and truly connect. You're listening to Rachel Thexton Connects.